Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast, podcast number 197. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Friday, November the 27th, from the James Strong Studio in Western St. Charles County. Did you have a good Thanksgiving? Man, I sure did. It was unbelievably good. It was fantastic. I loved it. A little different with the pandemic and all, but all in all, a good time was had by all. All of the crowds were smaller than they normally are at the house. The topic of today's podcast, though, has a bit to do with Thanksgiving. It has a bit to do with the pandemic. It has a bit to do with the run of the stock market. It has a bit to do with some people doing extremely well during this pandemic, in spite of the pandemic. It has to do with some people doing not so well. And the topic, I was sad for I had no shoes until I met the man who had no feet. Now, I'm not sure who was the first to say this. It's a wise saying. It sounds very Eastern in origin, but I've heard it attributed to Helen Keller, Stephen Wright, some Indian philosopher whose name I can't pronounce. I don't know who the first one to say it was, but it's a good way to look at life. I was sad for I had no shoes until I met the man who had no feet. We had a fantastic Thanksgiving. But things were different, okay? And Thanksgiving is a time of giving thanks, okay? We had the family over to the house. It was to be the immediate family, my boys and their immediate families, I should say that. No extended family. My parents weren't going to be a part of it. They're older. They needed to stay away from the crowds. We have others over as well. That didn't happen. In fact, one of my sons, they picked up a cold. At least they think it's a cold. As of right now, it's still a cold in their house. And, of course, they weren't going to come here if they had the sniffles and the sneezes. So they stayed home. But we were, could you say we were compliant with the rules made by the government? Less than 10 people. Okay, we were less than 10 people, unless you count curtain climbers. If that's the case, and some of them were infants. So if you count the curtain climbers, we were right. We were just a little over. If you don't count the curtain climbers, we were considerably under. So take that however you will. But we had a good time, and I hope you had a good time too. I'm doing the podcast today on Friday instead of a Saturday morning, mainly because thankfully I get Friday off from the day job. So I had the time I wanted to do it. Also, beginning Saturday, I guess, officially beginning Saturday, I'm going to start a brand new endeavor. I shouldn't say beginning a brand new endeavor. I would say that I am resuming an endeavor that's been going on in my family for some 55 years. How's that? Okay. About 55 years ago, my father purchased a 1951 Jaguar Mark VII with the intention of restoring this thing. I was a small boy when he bought it. I remember when he bought it. He basically did a tiny bit of work to it and then parked it in the garage, and there it's been ever since. Dad's not going to restore it. I asked him if I could pick it up. He said, sure, so I'm going to transfer that car from his garage, where it's been sitting for 55 years, to a shop that I've rented out here in Western St. Charles County with the intention of restoring this car to at least something close to what it was some 70 years ago. This is something that I've been wanting to do for a while. It's going to be a huge endeavor. It's going to take a lot of time, a whole lot of energy, and a whole lot of money. But that's okay. That's why you live life, to do things that are worth doing. So that's what I'll be starting tomorrow. So I did the podcast today. Now, I've told you before that I live a truly charmed life. I do. And if you think about it, you live a truly charmed life as well. Okay. Thanksgiving was different this year. Okay. Because of the pandemic. I suspect Christmas and New Year will be different as well. But you need to do what you can. We need to do what we can within reason to get on with our lives until this plague passes. And it will. And I don't say that because I've read it in the newspapers. I don't say that because the politicians have told us that it will. I say that because history shows that these things happen all the time and things always get back to normal eventually. Sometimes it's months, sometimes it's years, but eventually things get back to normal. Okay? History shows that. And while this is something that's unique to everybody listening to the sound of my voice, because I think you probably have to be 100 years old to remember the last time we had a true pandemic that really devastated this part of the world, the Western world, period, okay? And that was the Spanish flu back right after World War I. But it has happened many, many times in the past. And it's decimated societies. It's killed a lot of people. It's destroyed economies. But from the ashes has always risen the phoenix. And history shows that it will this time too. Now, surely we're sad that we cannot do what we want to do or be with those whom we love during this time. But in my ever-present attempt to view things with a glass half-full attitude, I'm going to offer you these stories, this essay, for your consideration. And again, the title is, I Was Sad for I Had No Shoes Until I Met the Man Who Had No Feet. In other words, I'm going to tell you some stories about how things are going on in the world around us for your consideration, to maybe take these stories, think about them, and maybe you can apply them to your everyday life so that maybe you won't think that God is dead and the war has begun, okay? Things aren't quite that bad. My resources for this essay, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, CNN, WGRZ, the LA Times, WLS, JP Morgan, and the Equal Times website. Okay? Story number one for your consideration. GE Appliances. Now, again, you're probably thinking, how can manufacturers of appliances have anything to do with this pandemic? How are you going to weave this into a glass half full attitude, Strong? Well, consider this. Back before the pandemic, GE Appliances, they make dishwashers, they make washing machines, they make dryers, they make refrigerators, they make freezers, okay? Before the pandemic, sales were up a bit, mainly due to the good economy. People have extra money. A new refrigerator, unless it goes out, is something you can put off until later. You don't like the color. It's making a noise. You want something a little bit bigger. You need something a little bit smaller. You want the added features. That's always something that can wait until tomorrow. Again, unless it shoots craps. Times were good. People were buying them. So sales were up before the pandemic hit. When the pandemic first hit, there was a blip, mainly because of supplies and people were panicking and hoarding money. But shortly thereafter, sales soared. They went through the roof because people were at home. And when they were at home, GE has a statistic. I'm not sure how they got this statistic, but they say they have a software program that does this. I don't know how. But they said that refrigerator doors were open 40% more than before the pandemic. Use of washers and dryers were up 22%. Doing your laundry at home, not taking it out, not wearing dry, cleaned clothes to work, okay, because you're working from home. Now, GE has invested in new technologies and added capacity, but there's still out of stock on a whole bunch of stuff. And I know this firsthand because number two son purchased a house not too long ago, and he needed to fill it up with appliances because he went from renting to buying, okay? He didn't have a refrigerator. He didn't have a washer. He didn't have a dryer, so he had to buy all this stuff. So he went to one of the sales, bought all three, and several months later, they were delivered. Several months later, they were delivered. So they were out of stock. Now, this just wasn't GE Appliances. This was Whirlpool as well, okay? The same thing. In fact, Whirlpool had upped their production some 25%. Now, in manufacturing, to up production 25%, that's huge. Because in manufacturing, quite often you don't make money unless you're running near capacity on your equipment. So if you're already running near capacity on your equipment, it's hard to bolster production without buying new equipment. And buying new equipment is not like going to the store and buying a television set. That stuff has to be planned, ordered, built, delivered. You cannot turn on a dime. But even that being said, Whirlpool was able to up their production 25%. But they're still out of stock on stuff, okay? Now, throughout this whole pandemic, consumer spending is down. It's down, but it's not out. There's still a whole lot of people out there spending a whole lot of money. Even those that didn't have a job, even those that got laid off or had their income compromised during the pandemic, got the stimulus checks, okay, which helped. Some of the things that were up, of course, household cleaners, soaps, way up because people wanted to get stuff clean. Vitamins and supplements, way up. People wanted to stay healthy. They wanted to avoid getting the virus. Hair dye, way up because women weren't going to the hairdresser. They were dyeing their own hair in their bathrooms, okay? Coffee, way up. Because, again, people weren't stopping at Starbucks on the way to work. They were buying it in the stores and making it at home. In other words, habits really didn't change. People were still washing, although more. They were still taking supplements, although more. But women still wanted to dye their hair. People were still going to drink coffee. They just got these goods from another source. Now, some things were down, of course. Cosmetics. If you're going to make your face pretty to go to work and you're not going to work, you're not going to waste time making your face pretty. Sun care products, way down. People weren't flying to the Gulf Coast to go on vacation. No need for the sunscreen. Gasoline. If you're working from home instead of driving 30 minutes there and 30 minutes back, you're using a lot less gasoline. Gasoline prices were down, or gasoline usage was down. Other things were down for reasons that had nothing to do with the pandemic. Because remember, even though we're in the middle of a pandemic, there's still other things that play into changing the economy or affecting supply and demand that have nothing to do with the pandemic. One of them is propane. The price of propane is way down because we have a glut of propane out there. Now, why is this? It has absolutely, positively nothing to do with the pandemic. In fact, you would think, why more people are staying at home, more people are grilling, many people have propane grills, so propane price usage should be up, right? Wrong. Because one of the biggest usage of propane is in the farm sector. Because when the farmers harvest their corn, harvest their soybeans, they get a certain price for that soybean depending on how much moisture is in the grain. And quite often, if the fields are damp, they have to harvest them because they have a window into which they can take that crop off and then still plant winter wheat, at least in this part of the country. But normally they harvest the grain, harvest the beans, and then they dry it. They dry it using propane heaters. Well, we had a very, very dry autumn. And the farmers just left the crops in the field a little bit longer and let Mother Nature, the sun, dry those pieces of corn, kernels of corn, beans, etc. They just harvested them and put them away. They didn't have to buy the propane to dry them. So there's a big glut of propane. Just a little rabbit hole I wanted to go down just to show that things change sometimes because of the pandemic. Sometimes the pandemic has no effect at all. Okay, so sometimes the pandemic has an effect. Sometimes it's not the only factor involved in the economy. This time is one of those times. Now, we all know, and you've heard on the show, and you've heard from other people, that a free society does as it wishes. We certainly do. A successful free society does as it wishes prudently. Now, I mention this because we're going to talk about behavior during the pandemic. We touched on it when I talked about Thanksgiving. Okay.